Every smartphone in your pocket, every electric car on the road, every wind turbine spinning on a hillside, every missile guidance system in a military arsenal, every data center powering the artificial intelligence revolution depends on minerals buried beneath African soil. And right now, at this very moment, the most powerful nations on Earth are locked in a high-stakes contest over who gets to dig them up. China has spent well over $100 billion locking down supply chains across the continent. Russia is trading weapons and mercenaries for mining concessions in the Sahel and Central Africa. The United States and Europe are scrambling to catch up after decades of treating Africa as a charity case rather than a strategic priority. India, Turkey, and the Gulf states are piling in with their own ambitions and their own checkbooks. But here is what none of them expected. African governments are no longer sitting at the table waiting for offers. They are setting the terms, rewriting contracts, ejecting companies that refuse to comply, demanding equity stakes, mandating local processing, and playing these global powers against each other with increasing skill and confidence. The scramble for Africa is real, but for the first time in modern history, Africa is scrambling back. And the outcome of this contest will shape the global economy, the energy transition, and the balance of power for the rest of this century. That is not exaggeration. That is what the data says. Before we go any further, I need to talk to you directly, and I need you to really hear this. This channel exists for one reason. The world gets a distorted, incomplete, and often outright dishonest picture of Africa. Mainstream media reduces an entire continent of 54 nations, over 1.4 billion people, more than 2,000 languages, and millennia of civilization to a handful of recycled images and tired stereotypes. War, famine, corruption, charity appeals. Helpless victims waiting for Western saviors. When Africa does make international headlines for its resources, the story is always framed around who is taking them. Never about who is fighting to keep them. It is always about what outsiders are doing to Africa. Never about what Africa is doing for itself. That is the narrative we refuse to accept. That is the narrative we are here to correct, dismantle, and replace with something honest. We dig into the geopolitics, the economics, the power plays, the history, and the real decisions that African leaders, entrepreneurs, scientists, and communities are making right now to reshape their own futures on their own terms. But here is the hard truth that I have to share with you. We cannot do this work alone. Independent channels like ours do not have billion-dollar media budgets. We do not have corporate sponsors dictating what we cover, or advertisers telling us to soften our message or avoid uncomfortable truths. What we have is you, and you are more powerful than you realize. Every single subscriber changes the equation. Every like tells the algorithm that this content deserves to be seen. Every share puts this video in front of someone who has never heard these perspectives before, someone who still believes the only stories worth telling about Africa are stories of failure. When you subscribe, you are not just following a channel. You are making a statement. You are saying that Africa's agency matters, that African voices deserve to lead in their own story, that the world deserves more than the same tired, patronizing narratives about a helpless continent waiting to be rescued. So if you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Right now, before you forget, before you get distracted, hit that subscribe button. Turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss what we publish. Share this video with at least one person who needs to see it. A friend, a colleague, a family member, anyone you know who cares about global affairs but has never seen Africa through this lens. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if you are already part of this community, if you have been with us from the beginning or found us last week, thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, you are the reason this channel exists. You are the reason these stories get told. Every new member you bring in strengthens what we are building together, and together we are building something that matters. Now let us get into the substance. Let us start with the raw numbers, because the sheer scale of what sits beneath Africa's surface is almost beyond comprehension, and it is essential to understand why every major power on the planet is scrambling for position. Africa holds over half of the world's cobalt reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone accounts for roughly 70% of global cobalt production. One country producing the majority of a mineral that is absolutely essential to every single lithium-ion battery manufactured on this planet. Without Congolese cobalt, the global electric vehicle industry grinds to a halt. That is not a theoretical risk. That is the current state of global supply chains. Africa holds nearly half of the global supply of manganese, a mineral critical for steel production, aluminum alloys, and emerging next-generation battery technologies that promise to be cheaper and more efficient than current lithium-ion designs. It contains the overwhelming majority of the world's platinum group metals, concentrated in South Africa's Bushveld complex and deposits in Zimbabwe, without which catalytic converters, hydrogen fuel cells, fiber optic cables, and countless industrial chemical processes simply cannot function. Africa sits on enormous and still only partially explored deposits of lithium across Zimbabwe, Mali, Ghana, the DRC, Nigeria, Namibia, and Ethiopia. It holds vast reserves of graphite in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Madagascar, graphite being essential for battery anodes and advanced materials. It possesses tantalum in the DRC and Rwanda, without which no smartphone or laptop could be manufactured. It holds chromium in South Africa and Madagascar, bauxite in Guinea, which produces the raw material for all aluminum on Earth, uranium in Niger and Namibia, and rare earth elements scattered across multiple nations that are only now being properly mapped and catalogued. Recent geological surveys conducted by the British Geological Survey, Digital Earth Africa, and National Geological Services across the continent have confirmed what experts long suspected but could not fully quantify. Africa's reserves of critical minerals are not just globally significant, they are unmatched. No other continent comes close, and the demand for these minerals is not growing gradually or incrementally. It is exploding at a pace that is straining every existing supply chain. The European Union estimates that demand for lithium will increase 12-fold by 2030. The International Energy Agency projects that cobalt demand will triple in the same timeframe. Graphite demand could increase by a factor of 25 by 2040 as battery production scales up worldwide. Rare earth demand is accelerating as countries race to manufacture wind turbines, electric motors, advanced sensors, and next-generation military equipment. There is no realistic, credible scenario in which the world meets its climate targets, builds out renewable energy at the required scale, electrifies global transportation, or sustains the pace of technological innovation in artificial intelligence and computing without massive and sustained increases in African mineral production. Every major government, every major corporation, every military planner on Earth has done this calculation. And that is why they are all converging on Africa at the same time. But Africa's mineral wealth has always attracted predators, and understanding the present requires understanding the past that created it. The colonial era was not simply a period of exploitation. It was a systematic, continent-wide restructuring of economies, societies, and physical infrastructure to serve the singular purpose of extracting wealth for foreign powers. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, European empires carved up Africa among themselves with rulers and pencils on maps, drawing borders that ignored the nation's kingdoms, cultures, and communities that had existed for centuries. The people who lived on the continent were not consulted. They were not considered. They were treated as obstacles to be managed or labor to be controlled. What followed was a period of extraction so thorough and so devastating that its consequences are still shaping African economies today. Gold from the Witwatersrand in South Africa built the financial architecture of the City of London. Diamonds from Sierra Leone, the Congo, Botswana, and Namibia enriched European royal houses and bankrolled empires. Rubber from the Congo Free State under the personal rule of King Leopold II of Belgium was harvested through a regime of forced labor, mutilation, and terror so extreme that an estimated 10 million Congolese people died. That number deserves to sit with you. 10 million people killed so that a European king could profit from rubber. Copper from the copper belt of northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, powered British and European industrialization. Oil from the Niger Delta fueled Western economies while devastating the environment and communities of the producing regions. Cocoa from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, cotton from Egypt and Sudan, coffee from Ethiopia and Kenya, palm oil from Nigeria and Cameroon. All flowed outward in vast quantities, generating enormous wealth for colonial powers while African workers received subsistence wages or were simply forced to labor without compensation. The infrastructure built during the colonial period is perhaps the most revealing evidence of what colonialism was actually designed to accomplish. Railways were built from mines to ports, not from African cities to other African cities, not to connect communities, facilitate internal trade, or build domestic markets. From mines to ports, roads connected extraction sites to shipping terminals, not schools to hospitals, not farms to markets. Educational systems were designed to produce clerks, translators, and low-level administrators to serve the colonial bureaucracy. Not engineers, scientists, doctors, or entrepreneurs who might build independent economies. The entire physical, educational, economic, and institutional architecture of colonial Africa was designed with laser precision for a single purpose: to extract wealth as efficiently as possible and prevent the emergence of anything that might threaten foreign control. When independence movements swept across the continent in the 1950s and 1960s, a generation of extraordinary leaders attempted to dismantle this architecture and build something new. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana nationalized key industries, invested in education, built the Akosombo Dam, and declared that African unity was the path to genuine sovereignty. Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia took majority control of the copper mines and redirected revenues towards schools, healthcare, and national development. Algeria fought an 8-year war of independence that cost over 1 million lives, then seized control of its oil and gas. Tanzania, under Julius Nyerere, pursued radical self-reliance and invested in universal education. Egypt, under Nasser, nationalized the Suez Canal, built the Aswan High Dam, and asserted Egyptian sovereignty over Egyptian resources. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso challenged French neocolonial economic structures and invested in food self-sufficiency, vaccination campaigns, and women's rights in just 4 years before he was assassinated. This era of resource nationalism was driven by a simple, powerful, and entirely legitimate conviction: the wealth beneath African soil belongs to African people. But the Cold War made genuine sovereignty almost impossible to sustain. The United States and the Soviet Union treated Africa as a geopolitical chessboard, backing rival factions, funding coups, arming proxies, and systematically undermining any government that threatened foreign access to strategic resources. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, was assassinated in 1961 with documented involvement of Belgian intelligence and the CIA because he insisted that Congolese resources should serve Congolese people. The CIA and MI6 engineered the overthrow of Nkrumah in Ghana in 1966. Sankara was killed in 1987 after challenging the French economic stranglehold on West Africa. Across the continent, leaders who prioritized national control over resources were removed, replaced by compliant dictators, or economically strangled through sanctions and capital flight. The structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in the 1980s and 1990s completed the job. Under the banner of economic liberalization, African governments were forced to privatize state-owned mines and industries, slash public spending on health and education, remove protections for local industries, and open their economies to foreign competition on terms that overwhelmingly benefited multinational corporations and foreign governments. The result was a deepening of the colonial economic pattern. Raw materials flowed out. Profits flowed out, technical knowledge stayed abroad, and the paradox that defines Africa's modern political economy was cemented into place: a continent with some of the richest mineral deposits on Earth and some of the poorest populations. This history is not a digression, it is the essential context for everything that follows. Because it explains why African governments approach foreign investment today with both ambition and suspicion. and why the current competition among global powers represents both an unprecedented opportunity and a deeply familiar threat. Now let us examine the major players currently fighting for access to African resources, their strategies, their strengths, and their weaknesses. We begin with China, because no other external actor has reshaped Africa's economic landscape more profoundly in the 21st century. China's engagement with Africa is the most ambitious and systematic external economic project the continent has seen since colonialism. Since the early 2000s, Beijing has constructed an unrivaled network of mining operations, infrastructure projects, industrial zones, and long-term supply agreements across every region of the continent through the Belt and Road Initiative. The numbers are staggering. The latest available figures indicate that 2025 saw the highest level of Chinese engagement in history, with construction contracts exceeding $128 billion and related investments surpassing $85 billion. Chinese companies now operate or hold significant stakes in cobalt mines across the DRC, lithium operations in Zimbabwe and Mali, manganese projects in South Africa and Gabon, copper mines in Zambia, iron ore in Guinea and Sierra Leone, gold operations in Ghana and Tanzania, and rare earth projects in multiple countries. What makes China's model uniquely competitive is its integration. A Chinese consortium entering an African country does not offer to develop a single mine. It offers a complete economic ecosystem, financing from Chinese state-owned banks, the China Development Bank, the Export-Import Bank of China, at interest rates that consistently undercut Western commercial lenders, construction by Chinese engineering firms that can mobilize tens of thousands of workers within weeks. Purpose-built transportation infrastructure, railways, highways, and deep-water port facilities designed to move extracted minerals to global markets efficiently. Guaranteed purchase agreements that provide host governments with predictable, bankable revenue streams for years or decades. Power generation infrastructure, hydroelectric dams, solar farms, coal-fired plants, to ensure operations can run reliably even in countries with fragile electrical grids. And visible social investments near project sites, hospitals, schools, sports stadiums, cultural centers, and housing developments that create goodwill and demonstrate immediate, tangible benefits to local communities and their political leaders. For an African government dealing with decaying colonial-era infrastructure, chronic fiscal pressure, high unemployment, a young and growing population demanding visible progress, and political opponents who can point to every delay as a failure, this model is extraordinarily attractive. A project that might take a decade of feasibility studies, environmental assessments, financing rounds, and stakeholder consultations to materialize under Western investment frameworks can break ground within months of a Chinese agreement. That speed matters, not just economically, politically. The debt trap narrative, which Western governments and media have promoted relentlessly, deserves careful and honest examination. The theory holds that China deliberately lends more than countries can repay, then seizes strategic assets or extracts political concessions when borrowers default. This narrative has been enormously influential in shaping Western policy, media coverage, and public opinion about Chinese engagement in Africa. But the best available academic research tells a more complicated story. Deborah Brotigam and her team at Johns Hopkins University, who maintain the most comprehensive database of Chinese loans to Africa, have found that Chinese debt restructuring has generally been more flexible and forgiving than the narrative suggests. In most cases of distress, Beijing has renegotiated terms, extended maturities, reduced interest rates, and in some cases written off portions of debt. The Hambantota port case in Sri Lanka, which is cited in virtually every Western article about Chinese debt traps, has been extensively debunked by multiple researchers who found that the port equity transfer was initiated by the Sri Lankan government for its own fiscal reasons, not forced by Beijing. None of this means that every Chinese deal is fair, transparent, or beneficial. Some contracts include provisions that heavily favor Chinese state enterprises. Information asymmetry is a real problem. In several countries, details of Chinese loan agreements have been classified or kept from public scrutiny, making it difficult to assess whether terms are genuinely advantageous. In Ethiopia, massive Chinese-financed infrastructure like the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway has delivered real economic connectivity, but also imposed debt obligations that constrain the government's fiscal flexibility. In Kenya, the Nairobi-Mombasa standard gauge railway has been criticized for significant cost overruns and disappointing revenue that may not justify the borrowing required. These are legitimate concerns. But characterizing all Chinese investment in Africa as a coordinated predatory scheme ignores the evidence, insults the intelligence and agency of African negotiators, and conveniently serves the geopolitical interests of Western governments that are trying to claw back influence on a continent they neglected for decades. Russia's strategy in Africa bears almost no resemblance to China's, and understanding it requires abandoning the infrastructure and investment lens entirely. Moscow's approach is built on the currency it has in abundance: military capability, security services, intelligence expertise, and a willingness to work with any government regardless of its human rights record, democratic credentials, or international standing. Since the mid-2010s, Russia has signed military cooperation agreements with over 40 African countries. The instruments of Russian influence are weapons sales, military training programs, counterinsurgency support, intelligence sharing, and most visibly, private military contractors. The Wagner Group, now reorganized as the Africa Corps following the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin in August 2023, operates in at least a dozen African countries. In Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and the Central African Republic, where military governments have expelled French forces and ruptured relationships with Western partners, Russian military personnel have stepped directly into the security vacuum. They provide the armed capability that keeps allied regimes in power, suppress internal rebellions, protect mining sites, and project Russian influence in regions that were once firmly within the French sphere of influence. The transactional logic is explicit. Russia provides security. In exchange, it receives mining concessions, resource access, diplomatic support in international forums, and strategic positioning. Moscow's $25 billion commitment to Egypt's El Dabaa nuclear energy program, its expanding relationships with the Alliance of Sahel states, agreements with Eritrea, Libya, and Sudan, and its growing diplomatic offensive at forums like the Russia-Africa Summit demonstrate that this is not a marginal effort, but a deliberate continental strategy. Russia is not attempting to match China's spending or replicate Western development models. It is carving out a distinctive and potent niche as the partner of choice for governments that face existential security threats, international isolation, or the kind of Western pressure that comes with conditions they are unwilling to accept. But the limitations and risks of the Russian model are substantial. Total Russian investment in Africa remains modest compared to China's. The economic benefits that flow to local populations from Russian engagement are difficult to document and in many cases appear negligible. Human rights organizations, including the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, have reported serious abuses by Wagner-linked personnel in the Central African Republic, Mali, Mozambique, and Libya, including extrajudicial killings, civilian displacement, and systematic looting. Russia's primary interest appears to be securing specific resource concessions and maintaining allied governments in power, rather than building the kind of broad-based economic partnerships that deliver jobs, infrastructure, and lasting development to ordinary citizens. For African governments facing immediate security crises, Russian support may solve the urgent problem. Whether it builds anything durable is a far harder question. The West, meaning primarily the United States and the European Union, has been caught badly off guard. For the better part of 3 decades following the Cold War, Western engagement with Africa centered on development aid, humanitarian intervention, peacekeeping, and selective investment in oil, gas, and a handful of commodities that directly served Western industry. Strategic engagement with Africa's broader mineral potential was minimal. The implicit assumption, rarely articulated but deeply embedded in Western policy, was that Africa was economically peripheral and would remain so indefinitely. The explosion of demand for critical minerals has obliterated that assumption so thoroughly that it has triggered something close to panic in Washington, Brussels, London, and Ottawa. Western governments now confront an uncomfortable and urgent reality. Their green energy ambitions, their electric vehicle industries, their advanced technology sectors, their defense supply chains, and their credibility on climate change all depend on minerals that China has spent 20 years methodically securing across Africa. The Western response is organized around the concept of friendshoring, building resource supply chains with countries that share democratic values, governance, transparency, and environmental standards. The US-Africa Business Center, the European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, the UK's British International Investment, and programs in Canada and Australia are all channeling capital into African mining. The pitch is genuinely attractive in principle: ethical sourcing practices, environmental sustainability, real technology transfer, capacity building for local workforces, transparent governance, meaningful community participation in decision-making. These are not just slogans, they represent lessons learned from decades of extractive foreign investment that left African communities worse off. But the fundamental problem is pace. Western investment frameworks require environmental impact assessments that can take years, social safeguard reviews, anti-corruption due diligence, governance benchmarks, public consultations, multi-layered approvals across multiple government agencies. Each of these requirements is individually reasonable and defensible. Collectively, they create a process so slow that it cannot compete with Chinese efficiency. A mining project that reaches production in 2 to 3 years under Chinese financing can easily take 7 to 10 years under a Western framework. For an African finance minister facing a yawning budget deficit, a restless population demanding jobs and services, and political opponents ready to brand every delay as incompetence, that gap is not theoretical or abstract. It is the difference between survival and collapse. Two additional groups of players deserve far more attention than they typically receive. India has been steadily and quietly expanding its mineral and resource interests across Africa over the past 2 decades. Major Indian conglomerates including Vedanta Resources, Tata Steel, and the Adani Group have invested in mining operations in Mozambique, South Africa, Tanzania, Zambia, and Madagascar. Indian engagement tends to be lower profile than Chinese investments but is substantial, growing, and driven by India's own massive demand for industrial minerals and energy resources as it pursues rapid economic development. The Gulf states, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are deploying sovereign wealth fund capital into African resources at an accelerating pace. The UAE's investments span mining, energy, logistics, ports, and agriculture across East, North, and West Africa. Turkey under Erdogan has dramatically expanded its diplomatic and commercial footprint, opening dozens of new embassies across the continent and actively pursuing construction, mining, and defense contracts from the Horn of Africa to the Sahel. These emerging players add critical layers of competition to an already crowded field, and most importantly from Africa's perspective, provide additional options, additional leverage, and additional bargaining power. Now, here is the most important part of this entire story, and it is the part that most analysts, most journalists, and most Western policymakers consistently miss or underestimate. The most consequential shift in the global resource landscape is not happening in Beijing, Moscow, Washington, Abu Dhabi, New Delhi, or Ankara. It is happening in Bamako, Accra, Kinshasa, Lusaka, Pretoria, and Abuja. African governments are using the unprecedented competition among global powers to demand better terms, force structural changes in how resources are developed, and capture more of the value generated by their own mineral wealth than at any point since independence. Start with Mali. The government has enacted legislation requiring foreign mining companies to grant the state a significant equity stake in all new lithium projects. The law includes mandatory provisions for local processing and technology transfer as non-negotiable conditions of market access. This is not a polite request from a weak government hoping for charity. It is a legal requirement backed by the sovereign authority of the state. Foreign companies that want access to Malian lithium must invest in building Malian processing capacity, train Malian workers, transfer technical knowledge, and accept Malian state ownership. Those that refuse do not get permits, full stop. Ghana has taken a similarly assertive approach. The government has mandated a 13% free carried interest in all new lithium projects. Free carried interest means the Ghanaian state receives a direct ownership stake in mining ventures without contributing capital. Ghana is also implementing aggressive local bedilasation requirements, mandating that raw ore be processed into higher value intermediate and finished materials on Ghanaian soil before export. The strategic logic is clear. Ghana wants more than mining royalties and export taxes. It wants manufacturing jobs, technical expertise, supply chain development, and a permanent structural position in the global battery value chain. The Democratic Republic of Congo offers the highest stakes example. The DRC produces approximately 70% of the world's cobalt, giving it leverage that few countries in history have possessed over a single critical commodity. In 2023, the DRC government renegotiated a landmark mining agreement with a major Chinese consortium, clawing back equity stakes that had been conceded under earlier, less favorable terms and demanding substantial infrastructure investment as a non-negotiable condition of continued access. The government has also moved to establish a state-controlled cobalt marketing entity, asserting greater control over pricing, sales channels, and the terms on which Congolese cobalt reaches the global market. These moves are imperfect and contested. Implementation challenges are real, but the direction of travel is unmistakable. The DRC is determined to use its extraordinary natural endowment as leverage for structural economic transformation. Zambia provides another instructive case. The country has moved decisively away from the colonial model of foreign-dominated copper mining toward a more assertive framework of state participation and transparent resource governance. By renegotiating contracts with major mining companies, increasing government equity in key projects, strengthening regulatory oversight, and successfully navigating a highly complex sovereign debt restructuring involving Chinese, Western, and multilateral creditors under the G20 Common Framework, Zambia has demonstrated that African governments can engage in sophisticated, multi-party financial negotiations and emerge with outcomes that serve the national interest. These case studies are not isolated curiosities. They represent a structural shift in how African governments approach their mineral wealth across the continent. The old model, a foreign company arrives, negotiates a deal with minimal transparency and minimal state involvement, extracts the resource, ships it overseas as raw material, captures virtually all the value added through processing and manufacturing abroad, and leaves behind environmental damage and depleted deposits, is being actively challenged and in many cases dismantled. But intellectual honesty requires confronting the enormous challenges that persist alongside these advances. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the cobalt boom has brought economic growth, but also intensified armed conflict that kills thousands of people every year. In the eastern provinces, dozens of armed groups compete violently for control of mining areas, funding their operations through illegal extraction, smuggling, and taxation of artisanal miners. Artisanal and small-scale mining operations, in which men, women, and children dig with hand tools in unventilated tunnels, unregulated shafts, and hazardous open pits, remain a major feature of the cobalt supply chain. Investigations by Amnesty International, UNICEF, and investigative journalists have documented systematic child labor, chronic toxic exposure to cobalt dust and heavy metals, fatal tunnel collapses that bury entire mining teams, and ruthless exploitation by middlemen and armed groups who purchase cobalt from desperate miners at a tiny fraction of its global market value. The human cost of the global battery revolution is not evenly distributed. It is concentrated overwhelmingly among the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. Environmental destruction from mining across the continent is severe, widespread, and in many areas worsening. Large-scale mining operations cause deforestation on a massive scale, obliterating ecosystems and biodiversity that cannot be recovered within human lifetimes. Chemical processing using cyanide, mercury, sulfuric acid, and other toxic substances contaminates rivers, lakes, and groundwater systems that millions of people depend on for drinking water, irrigation, livestock, and fishing. Soil degradation from mining waste and overburden renders agricultural land unusable for generations. Air pollution from smelting, refining, and dust from open-pit operations causes respiratory disease, cancer, and chronic illness in surrounding communities. Tailings dams, the massive engineered reservoirs that hold billions of tons of toxic mining waste, pose catastrophic risks when they fail, as has occurred repeatedly around the world with devastating consequences for downstream communities and ecosystems. The ecological cost of meeting escalating global demand for critical minerals is real. It is growing, and it is falling disproportionately on communities that have the least political power, the least legal protection, and the least capacity to resist. Corruption remains one of the most corrosive obstacles to transforming mineral wealth into broad-based development. In countries with weak institutions, inadequate judicial independence, or entrenched patronage systems, mining contracts are negotiated behind closed doors by officials who personally benefit from terms that disadvantage the state and its citizens. Revenue from mining operations vanishes into offshore bank accounts, shell companies, political financing networks, and patronage systems that distribute wealth to elites while public services starve. Progressive mining laws that look excellent on paper go unenforced in practice because the regulatory agencies tasked with implementation lack funding, expertise, independence, or all three. The gap between policy aspiration and operational reality is one of the most persistent and damaging features of Africa's resource governance landscape. Regional cooperation is emerging as one of the most promising strategic responses to these challenges. The African Union, through the African Continental Free Trade Area and the African Minerals Development Center, is working to harmonize resource policies across the continent, establish minimum governance and environmental standards, and build collective bargaining power that individual nations cannot achieve alone. The logic is both clear and urgent. When African countries compete against each other to attract foreign investment by cutting royalty rates, weakening environmental regulations, offering tax holidays, and accepting unfavorable terms, the result is a race to the bottom in which every country loses and only the foreign investor wins. When countries coordinate, they can establish binding floors on royalties, enforce common environmental standards, prevent the worst forms of labor exploitation, and ensure that the continent collectively captures a fair share of the value its resources generate. Regional economic communities including ECO-WS, SADC, the East African Community, and ECOS are developing coordinated trade, investment, and governance frameworks that aim to create integrated mineral value chains spanning multiple countries. Full implementation remains distant and is complicated by genuine disparities in economic power, political interests, and institutional capacity among member states. But the direction is clear, and the momentum is building. Technology and innovation are fundamentally reshaping what is possible in African resource management. Automated mining operations in South Africa's platinum sector are achieving higher mineral recovery rates while dramatically reducing the catastrophic labor risks that have historically made deep-level mining one of the most dangerous occupations on Earth. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are revolutionizing geological mapping, mineral exploration, and resource estimation, making it possible to identify new deposits with greater speed and precision than traditional methods ever allowed. Drone and satellite-based surveys can map vast areas of terrain and assess geological potential in weeks rather than years. Green mining techniques, including improved water recycling, reduced chemical use, electrification of mining equipment, and carbon capture, are lowering the environmental footprint of extraction and processing. Innovations in hydrometallurgy, bioleaching, and mineral processing are making it technically and economically feasible to extract valuable minerals from low-grade ores, tailings, and waste materials that were previously considered worthless. Across the continent, technology hubs and innovation ecosystems are producing breakthroughs with direct relevance to sustainable resource development. Nairobi, Lagos, Cape Town, Kigali, Accra, and Dar es Salaam are emerging as centers of technological innovation, producing a new generation of engineers, data scientists, materials scientists, and entrepreneurs who are building distinctly African solutions to African challenges. These advances are critically important because they give African countries the technical tools to extract more value from their mineral endowments, process materials domestically rather than shipping raw ore overseas, minimize environmental damage, improve worker safety, and build the knowledge economy that diversified, resilient development ultimately requires. A dimension of this story that almost never receives adequate attention in international coverage is the emergence of African corporations, investors, and entrepreneurs as significant independent players in the continental resource economy. The dominant narrative frames Africa's mineral story exclusively as a competition among foreign powers for access, with Africa as the passive terrain on which this contest plays out. This framing is not just incomplete, it is misleading. A growing and increasingly confident class of African-owned companies, financial institutions, and business leaders are becoming major players in their own right. Aliko Dangote's massive petroleum refinery in Lagos, Nigeria, the largest single-train refinery in the world, is fundamentally reshaping West African energy economics by reducing the region's chronic dependence on imported refined petroleum products. African-owned mining companies are expanding operations across national borders. African private equity funds are investing in resource-related infrastructure. A new generation of African engineers, geologists, metallurgists, process chemists, environmental scientists, and business leaders is building exactly the kind of technical, managerial, and entrepreneurial capacity that colonial systems deliberately suppressed and structural adjustment programs subsequently hollowed out. This emerging African industrial class may ultimately matter more for the continent's long-term development trajectory than any single deal negotiated with China, Russia, or the West, because lasting economic transformation requires more than better government policies and more favorable foreign investment terms. It requires a domestic private sector with the capital, technical expertise, institutional knowledge, global networks, and competitive ambition to build and operate world-class enterprises. When African companies control mining operations, processing facilities, logistics networks, and technology development, the economics change fundamentally. Profits are reinvested locally rather than repatriated to foreign headquarters. Technical knowledge accumulates within African institutions rather than remaining the proprietary asset of foreign firms. Supply chains develop organically around African industrial hubs, creating multiplier effects that generate employment, stimulate adjacent industries, and build the dense economic ecosystems that characterize developed economies. The emergence and growth of this African entrepreneurial and industrial class is one of the most important economic stories on the continent, and it deserves far more attention than it receives. Environmental sustainability is increasingly understood not as a constraint on economic development, but as a prerequisite for it. Governments across the continent are introducing new regulations and standards designed to minimize mining-related environmental damage, protect water resources and biodiversity, and ensure that communities near mining operations share meaningfully in the economic benefits. Frameworks, including the Responsible Mineral Development Initiative and the Africa Mining Vision, are promoting best practices in governance, environmental management, community engagement, and long-term land rehabilitation. The African Development Bank, United Nations agencies, and bilateral development partners are supporting efforts to embed sustainability into every stage of the mining value chain, from initial exploration through extraction, processing, closure, and post-mining land rehabilitation. A growing recognition is taking hold that environmental destruction does not merely harm local communities. It undermines the long-term viability of the mining sector itself by degrading the natural capital on which future extraction depends, generating political opposition that can halt projects, and creating legal and reputational risks that increase the cost of doing business. The stakes of what happens in Africa over the next decade extend far beyond the continent's borders. The minerals beneath African soil will largely determine how quickly the world transitions to renewable energy and whether climate targets are met. They will determine how affordable electric vehicles become and therefore how rapidly global transportation is decarbonized. They will shape which nations lead in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced semiconductor manufacturing, next-generation military technology, and space exploration. They will influence the resilience and stability of global supply chains that affect the price of everything from consumer electronics to medical devices to defense systems. They will determine whether the energy transition is accomplished in a way that is just, equitable, and genuinely sustainable, or whether it simply reproduces the extractive colonial patterns of the past in a new technological guise. There is no credible version of the future in which Africa's mineral wealth does not matter. The only question is who benefits from what Africa produces. Four forces will determine the answer to that question. The first is institutional strength. Can African governments build, fund, and sustain the regulatory bodies, independent judiciaries, revenue management systems, and administrative capacity needed to enforce mining laws, manage revenues transparently, hold both domestic and foreign actors accountable, and resist capture by elites? The countries that succeed in building strong, independent, competent institutions will be best positioned to convert mineral wealth into lasting, broad-based development. Those that fail will repeat the cycles of extraction, corruption, and inequality that have defined the post-colonial era. The second is regional unity. Can African nations sustain the political coordination, mutual trust, and institutional framework needed to present a genuine collective front to outside powers, set and enforce continental minimum standards, and prevent foreign actors from exploiting divisions between countries? The history of external powers dividing and conquering African nations to secure favorable terms is long well documented and ongoing. Overcoming this pattern requires sustained political commitment, shared strategic vision, and a willingness to subordinate short-term national advantage to long-term continental benefit. The third is technological capacity. Can the continent build the educational institutions, research universities, national laboratories, and innovation ecosystems that produce not just skilled workers but globally competitive enterprises, cutting-edge research, and proprietary technologies? This requires decades of sustained investment in human capital, scientific infrastructure, and the enabling conditions for entrepreneurship and innovation. The fourth is political will. Will African leaders invest mineral revenues in public goods, infrastructure, universal education, healthcare systems, and productive economic diversification, or will they succumb to the temptation of short-term deals that enrich a narrow elite while leaving the broader population behind? Will they listen to and include the communities most directly affected by mining and decision-making processes? Will they build accountability mechanisms that outlast individual administrations? None of these outcomes is guaranteed. The forces pulling toward extraction without transformation, toward corruption, toward environmental destruction, toward dependency on foreign powers and foreign expertise are powerful, well-resourced, and deeply entrenched. But the forces pushing in the other direction, toward genuine agency, sovereignty, innovation, institutional development, and self-determination are growing stronger. Every contract renegotiated, every processing plant built on African soil, every young engineer trained at an African university, every regional agreement that raises standards, and every community that successfully demands inclusion in decisions about resources beneath their land represents a step in a direction that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. Africa is not waiting for permission from anyone to claim its rightful place in the global economy. It is already doing so, unevenly, imperfectly, against formidable obstacles, but unmistakably. The question that ultimately matters is not whether Africa has power. It does. The question is whether that power translates into real, tangible, lasting prosperity for the hundreds of millions of people who live above the minerals. Whether the artisanal cobalt miner in Katanga, the farmer whose land was taken for a lithium operation in Mali, the young woman in Accra engineering battery recycling systems, the mother raising her children in the shadow of a tailings dam in Zambia, the geology student in Kinshasa studying to understand what lies beneath his country, and the community leader in Mozambique negotiating with a multinational graphite company will see their lives fundamentally improved by the wealth beneath their feet. That is the measure that matters, not aggregate GDP growth, not foreign direct investment figures, not geopolitical influence scores, but whether the people of this continent, after centuries of having their resources taken from beneath them, finally genuinely and durably share in the prosperity those resources create. If you have made it this far, you understand why this story matters. You understand that the future of energy, technology, and global power is being decided right now on African soil, in African capitals, in African communities, by African people. And you understand that the stories we tell about these events, the narratives we build, the perspectives we amplify shape outcomes just as much as the events themselves. If this video gave you something new, a perspective you had not considered, a fact you had not encountered, a reason to think differently about what Africa is and what it is becoming, then do not let it end here. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit that notification bell so you are part of every conversation we start. Like this video because every like tells the algorithm that content about African agency, African sovereignty, and African potential deserves to reach a wider audience. Share it with someone you know, a friend, a colleague, a family member, a teacher, a student, anyone who still pictures Africa as a continent defined by its problems rather than its enormous, under-recognized potential, and leave a comment. Tell us what you think. What is the strongest force shaping Africa's future? Is it sovereignty, accountability, technology, regional unity, entrepreneurship, political will, something we have not even named yet? We read every single comment, and your perspectives strengthen this community in ways you may not realize. This is not just a channel, it is a community of people committed to changing how the world understands and engages with Africa. And you, right now, in this moment, are a part of it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. We will see you in the next one.